But that wasn't the ancient world. The ancient world was a oral culture, and writing came into that oral culture and did not immediately provide any kind of revolution. So one of the things that Lundwall assumes is that if the Nephites bring this kind of literate culture, that it's going to explode and affect everybody.
Yeah,
and
would transform the culture.
Yeah, it just isn't true in world history. It just doesn't happen. It isn't even true in Mesoamerica. So in Mesoamerica,
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm very excited for today's interview. I'm going to be doing an episode with Brant Gardner, and we're going to be responding to some recent episodes and podcasts that have been done on a couple of different podcasts on Mormonism Live with Dr. John Lundwall. I believe he has a PhD in myth and religious studies, and he has sort of presented an argument and a case that not just specific things in the Book of Mormon are anachronistic, and we've talked about anachronisms, both physical and textual anachronisms in previous episodes, my interviews with Brant and other scholars. And critics would point to different things like, okay, DNA sort of disproves the Book of Mormon, or anachronisms disproves the Book of Mormon, Isaiah, horses, steel, sheep, goats. They would say there's 19th century influences or elements like the King James Bible or Protestant sounding sermons or conversion experiences. But his argument, his thesis is that the Book of Mormon itself is an anachronism, that it's out of time and place in Mesoamerica because it portrays a literate people, literate society who are writing, historical records and their sermons and doctrine. And he's saying that the Mesoamerican people during, 600 BC to 400 AD were predominantly an oral society, oral culture. And if there was any writing, it would have been to support like ritual. So he's saying that it doesn't fit, and there's no historical evidence, archaeological evidence of this sort of literate writing or civilization, aka therefore the Book of Mormon is sort of proven non-historical, and this is sort of like a smoking gun to disprove Book of Mormon historicity. And for people who don't believe in the Book of Mormon, for either ex-Mormons or critics, this is probably like a new argument and probably further solidifies, it's definitely false, the whole text. And I think for the average maybe believer, somebody who's maybe maybe a little bit more informed, this is sort of like a new argument, new criticism from someone who he's got a PhD and he seems to really know what he's talking about. And including myself, there's like, okay, this raises some challenges and some questions, and let's see, is there a response to any of this, or is it case closed? And Brant, you've been willing to come on and try to respond to some of the arguments and things that John Lundwall brought up. So I appreciate that we're going to do this interview. I'm curious, what was your first reactions before we sort of get into his main arguments? Yeah. What was like your first reactions to the episode?
Well, what I remember is following through, and it felt like it was like the first half of what he was doing in the first episode, where he's just giving sort of general, here's historical development of humanity and how it happens. And I'm going, oh yeah, this is actually pretty good stuff.
So you're agreeing with a lot of what he was saying.
Yeah, a lot of what he's talking about, when he says things are, culture is going to grow up around wells, meeting places where you get together to have water because water is essential. I mean, there's a lot of that where you go, yeah, okay, there's a lot of civilization that began that way. Now, none of that has anything to do with the Book of Mormon. That is just how general society seems to have worked. And the other thing that is important to realize about that is that it is a generalization. And you can say that this is how many things happen. But if you really look through history, you're going to find exceptions to many of those things. And one of the things he said in a later episode, and I forget which one, but he was talking about the fact that he gets his PhD from this Joseph Campbell School of Mythology. And he said that one of the papers that he had written or something was deconstructing Joseph Campbell, and particularly the monomyth, the idea of this hero with 1,000 faces being sort of a universal myth of mankind. And he said as he deconstructed that, what he found out was that the monomyth wasn't mono, that it really combines multiple strands of different kinds of things. And the idea that there is really only this one myth, behind humanity doesn't necessarily work. Well, he's absolutely correct in that. But then he doesn't apply it to his own work. And so what happens in the rest of what we see in episode 1 is he is assuming certain kinds of his own monomyth about the Book of Mormon in the New World and not looking at, a wider picture or different things. And I think we'll come to that as you go through your questions.
Okay, sounds good. Had you heard of him before you watched the episode? I'd never heard of him before.
No.
But yeah, he's been on Mormonish. We're probably going to be responding mostly to the first episode. Maybe we'll touch on some of the rest. I've not watched through all of them, so I've mostly prepared my questions around sort of the first episode or two. I know he was on Mormonism Live as well. And I have to say, the first time I listened to it, I normally listen to videos or podcasts when I'm at the gym. And because it was a little bit more technical, I didn't absorb everything the first time. So I had to go back and sort of rewatch it to sort of capture what his main arguments and points were. Okay. So I've got written up questions and we're going to try to do our best to sort of like steelman the arguments he's making. And then, because of your expertise in Mesoamerica, being a scholar, that you might be able to provide a response, or maybe other scholars that you have spoken to as well. So he talked about how there's oral cultures and then there's literate cultures, and that the oral cultures existed, first going back thousands of years ago, that, human society was very much oral. And when it came to religion as well, there would have been a lot of like ritual and like dance and things. And then there would have been a lot of like oral stories and myths. And then it was later on, over thousands of years, that societies became more literate, like writing records and histories and things. So for example, a lot of Bible scholars would say that the first, say, 11 chapters of Genesis is probably more coming from oral traditions from like different cultures, that it's not literal history as we would understand it today. So like, say, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, there's different creation accounts, or the global flood or Tower of Babel, that they may have been coming from different sort of cultures that had those oral traditions. And then it became sort of like put, written down and then into the Bible. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question that humanity was oral for a lot longer than it's ever been literate. And the next thing is, because we live in a very literate society where we have this odd assumption that we're 100% literate, and we get surprised when we find that there is someone who doesn't read. And so we end up with actual functional illiteracy more than total illiteracy. But that wasn't the ancient world. The ancient world was a oral culture, and writing came into that oral culture and did not immediately provide any kind of revolution. You would think that writing would, automatically trigger a whole bunch of things, but doesn't necessarily. It becomes the permanent record so that you don't have to have the human being who memorizes everything.
Right.
But they still had people who memorized everything. It's just that now you had another source and you had a place to go to.
So like another tool or resource.
Yeah. And for a long time, you had that record, but people would still communicate them orally. So somebody might read the record and it would be there, but the idea was they would then learn that and then be able to speak it. And so you have all of these people who still do not read, or at least do not read much. In the old world, you would have people who would be able to read certain words because they see them all the time. For example, if we see stop signs and the word stop, not only because of the shape and color of the sign, but that word, even if you can't read, you recognize that word meaning stop because of its context. And there's a lot of people who could do that. In one of the texts that I was reading, the woman was talking about literacy in the ancient world and in Greek. And this one stone cutter basically said, I can only read the capital letters. So you've got, your capital letters and then what we call lowercase. He couldn't read that. The only thing he could read were the kinds that he put on stone. So only the things that he needed to know. And if it was written a different way, he couldn't read that. So you had, for a very, very long time, minimal literacy. The idea in ancient Israel about how literate it was, estimates will run between 10 and 18% literacy for Israel. And that assumes that it was a little bit higher than some of the surrounding cultures. So you have literature, but you have a very oral society, and then you can see oral elements that seep into the written text, the way texts are written. You can see orality in them. Now, you get to the Book of Mormon and you see exactly the same thing. You see elements of orality that are written into the way the text is constructed. And then, even though it's very obviously literate because it's written down and it talks about it being written down, you can tell with the way things are set that that you're still basically an oral population. But we have things in the Book of Mormon that talk about they opened their scriptures and read them. Well, if you think about that, it's in most of those cases absolutely impossible because they didn't have anything they could carry with them. So when you open them, you're opening your mind. You're repeating them. You've got Abinadi before the priest. You've got Ammon before the king, and they're all the text says I'm reading the scripture. But you have
so they couldn't have been carrying with them like their quad.
Yeah,
there wouldn't have been plates of the scriptures that all of them could have carried with them.
Nobody has that. Nobody has that. And the word is there. And if you're an absolute literalist and you think every single word is, God breathed and not part of translation. But if you really look at the way that texts are being used, at the end of King Benjamin's speech, he says that he has copies made and sent out, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder about that. Would that indicate like they're scrolls or something then? Or
so, let's have a printing press long before the printing press was invented. And immediately after he gives this thing, he has these copies made of his speech. And then they have to be typeset. And then, and you got 30 or 40, 50,000 leaflets. No, that doesn't happen. What you do is you have maybe 10 copies and you hand them to someone who goes to that tribal unit and reads them. This is the way it happened all throughout the ancient world. This is the way it happened in Israel. This is the way it happened in Rome. This is the way it happened in Greece. You don't have this massive literature, literary format where everybody gets this information. You have one or two people who will take it there and read it to them. And you see that in the Book of Mormon. The other things you see in the Book of Mormon, you see poetic structures in the Book of Mormon that are elements of orality. And many of them are the same kinds of things that you see in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament has these elements of orality. And these poetic structures in an oral world helped people understand and remember because they were memorable items. So you get.
Can you give an example of what you mean by that? Like, are you leaning towards like chiasmus, or are you talking about something else?
Chiasmus is certainly one of them. Chiasms are there because some of them are easy to remember. So hickory dickory dock, the mouse ran up the clock struck one, down he run, hickory dickory dock. That's a chiasm. It's a very simple thing. You go through the story and then back out of the story, and it helps everybody get refreshed on what you're doing. So if you're speaking orally, the major difference between orality and literacy or literate text is that if you don't understand something that's written down, you can read it again. You don't have that when you're talking to an audience. When you're talking to an audience, you watch their faces or look at the responses, and sometimes you go, "Oh, I did not explain that well enough. I should do it again," so they get it. Or you have these poetic forms that remind them what you just told them. So we see those kinds of things showing up in the text. So from my standpoint, I would see, as far as this argument about orality in literature, he's absolutely right about the progress. I don't think he's correct that the Book of Mormon is an absolutely literate text. I think there's a lot of information in there that indicates that there's some underlying cultural orality behind it. In fact, I've got a book that's coming out, we hope in November, that has a section on these oral elements in the Book of Mormon. But the next thing is, how do you get that, into the Book of Mormon? Well, again, you go back to where does the Book of Mormon begin? It begins in what we know had literature, which was Israelite society. It begins in a society that we know was already writing down sermons, because we have Isaiah, we have Jeremiah, we have these authors from the contemporary time period that are doing exactly what we see in the Book of Mormon. And then we have people who left that time period and came to the New World. So, the argument that they forgot everything that they learned and never brought any of that with them is really quite unusual, particularly given the emphasis that you have early on about, these records and why you're keeping them, et cetera. And it all ties back to a culture where we know that they had it and know they had that information. So everything about the orality, again, if you look at the wide picture of humanity, yes, that's what happened. If you look at the details, it's much more complex. And as far as the Book of Mormon, it actually fits very nicely into a society that has incipient it's incipient literacy, in that it's focused on the elites and not everybody is reading.
Right. Okay. And so whenever I listen to his episode, I think he talked like writing emerged, was it around maybe 3,000, 3,500 BCE in certain areas. It probably depends upon like the civilization or the culture when it goes from, oral to literate. In terms of like, say, in the old world, in Israel, at around what time did they begin going from like oral to like writing down, becoming a literate society, writing down, sermons in these books? I know a lot of Bible scholars would say a lot of the books of the Bible probably weren't written until maybe the 8th to the 5th century BCE, and there's maybe some dispute
Well, yeah,
the Pentateuch was compiled.
Yeah, we've got Isaiah, and the uncontroversial chapters of Isaiah are written 700 BC, in that ballpark. And they had been writing prior to that. So you probably get, 1,000, 1,200 when Hebrew writing is coming in. But the Egyptians have been writing, the Babylonians have been writing, lots of people have been writing and been able to record long texts. So the idea that you could record history regardless of what your writing system is, because you've got the cuneiform, you've got the Egyptian, both hieroglyphs, and then later on the hieratic and demotic, which are changing the script, not the language. But all of these scripts are able to record the language. And again, whatever they wanted to record, whatever they wanted to write, they could do it. And I suspect there's some of these other questions that we'll get to, so I'm not going to try and jump the gun on your questions until you ask them.
Right. So you're saying that in Israel at that time and other cultures and civilizations, they would have been literate at that time before Lehi and his family would have left 600 BC.
Long before. Yeah. You've got Hebrew writing you can take back maybe to 1,200, but in the area around them, you've got writing that goes a lot further back. And then, his point is talking about writing styles, and specifically, he was talking about the kind of writing that is going to, for some reason, the type of writing is going to restrict the kind of texts that you write. And that's probably his weakest argument, because it assumes that there's something about the writing system that limits the way you think. And there's no evidence anywhere in the world that holds true. It's certainly influential, but no, it doesn't limit what you can think. And then as far as, developing things, you've got, both the Egyptian cuneiform, Hebrew writing, all of those are not alphabetic writing systems. They're more syllabic, with the Hebrew actually, leaving out the vowel characters. And
that was only brought up in the episode that it's a specific writing system that the Nephites were using in Mesoamerica, and that it was an alphabetic writing system. That was one of the points that he made.
Well, his point seems to be that the only writing system that we know much about are the Maya, and Mesoamerica is the only place that had writing systems. And I think there's now evidence of, I think I saw like maybe 15 different scripts. So it wasn't a monolithic single writing system. There were several different of them, and like I say, we have most of the evidence for the Maya, and are able to read 95% of what they wrote, and has been retained. For multiple reasons, there's a lot that's been lost. Obviously, the Spaniards burned a whole bunch of books, and that caused a lot of things to be lost. But the other thing that happens in Mesoamerica, if you kind of look at where you're finding texts, you get your texts either from carved stone, and they didn't start doing that until, let's see, you're getting them about 400 or AD 400. So they don't start carving in stone until near the end of the Nephite period, when the Book of Mormon is ending. And if you don't write things in stone, many things tend to be erased. Now, they found a lot of pots that they've written on, and there are some pots that have some pretty good texts. But we found one temple, San Bartolo, that has these paintings on the walls that were just fantastic, and they date for about 200 BC. And so we know that they were writing. They know that we had texts. We know that they had all this complicated stuff going on. And some of those we can't read because the language had changed after 200 BC. The writing system had changed so that they can't read all of the text. But they're writing. So why don't we have more of it? Well, we were fortunate to find that because the paintings wear off. If you look at any of the Maya ruins and any of the stelae that you find, they're all these white structures and, gray stone slab. They were all painted. A lot of the temples were painted red. And so you'd walk into a city and it wasn't white stone. It was big red buildings with, color all over them. And lots of things were painted. And then they had some interesting ideas. So, I think one of the paintings, they find blue paint on somebody's face. So we don't expect a blue face, but they did for whatever reason. But the point is, if it was painted, you lost a lot because the environment does not preserve a lot of those things.
Right, that would come off.
Yeah.
Over time, yeah.
Whatever they decided to write on a pot, and many of them just says this pot belongs to so-and-so, and it's for drinking cacao. So this cacao drinking cup belonged to so-and-so. And sometimes it tells the artist who painted but you don't get long texts for a couple of reasons. One, carving in stone is difficult, and so you don't carve really, really long text in stone unless it has to do with the kings, and then they want to aggrandize themselves, and they'll commission somebody to write something in stone.
And doesn't the Book of Mormon, it talks about, I think it's coriantumrs stone, who was like one of the last kings of
Yeah.
It's kind of like a.
It says that he brings a stone and that it's a large one, and it talks about history. That fits beautifully into what we know is happening in Mesoamerica.
Yeah, because Mayan kings would have done that, a bit of almost like his genealogy or like some of the wars, things about the king. Yeah.
And what all those things were, since we only have the description of, very brief description of what it was, we can guess based on Mesoamerican history. But we do know that at that time period when that stone is discussed in the Book of Mormon, that kind of stone monument existed and was being used in Mesoamerican cultures and in the area where we suspect that coriantumr would have come from. So it fits with the time period and the place. But the point I was making is this whole idea that there's some limitation in the language. You didn't have it in the old world. There's no reason to believe that a Nephi, and there's some pretty decent evidence that I think is being fairly well accepted, that Nephi was a trained scribe. If you are a trained scribe, you have a bunch of texts that you already know. And of course, he's not going to forget what he learned. He's going to bring that and he's going to teach at least his children. He's going to teach a certain lineage. That doesn't mean that everybody learns it. Jared Dine wrote the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, which is still a very important book for understanding world development and culture. And one of the specific things he talks about is the fact that not all innovations persist. That there are lots of cases where a really good innovation that later catches on was started in a certain place and then they just dropped it. They never used it again, and it was reintroduced when some other culture came in. Fishing was one of them, fishing hooks, if I remember correctly. There was a case where they had them and then they just stopped using them, said we don't want to do that. So one of the things that Lundwall assumes is that if the Nephites bring this kind of literate culture, that it's going to explode and affect everybody.
Yeah, but transform the culture.
Yeah, it just isn't true in world history. It just doesn't happen. It isn't even true in Mesoamerica. So in Mesoamerica, we have these writing systems that are focused in, for people who have the mental image of Mexico that kind of looks like a boot. You get the writing systems up into the boot, the toe of the boot, down at the heel of the boot, a little bit south of that, and then up into the ankle and maybe a little bit more. But if this is, let's say, a wading boot, or a knee-high boot, if you get up to the knee level, you're up into the Aztecs and Teotihuacano cultures that do not have a similar writing system. So here are people that are really close together. They're in close contact. They trade with each other. And writing systems have not diffused to them. So to say that the Nephite method of writing should have caused a revolution goes against what we know of the other writing system that was there that didn't cause a revolution. So, yeah, the assumption that it should have done something goes against, again, this worldwide history. You can certainly come up with times and places where they did. But again, if you, in his words, deconstruct, if you deconstruct the monomyth and you say, let's look at all of the issues, yeah, things die out or people don't accept them. There's multiple reasons why innovations are not immediately accepted.
So I think in one of the recent videos I watched with him, he showed a few scriptures in the Book of Mormon where it talked about not just like the Nephites, keeping the records, but also Lamanites as well, that they were writing. I have also been reading recently in the Book of Mormon in the war chapters. Moroni wrote a letter to, I think it's Amaron, and pretty much saying like surrender, the prisoners you have, and then Amaron sends a letter back, and he would argue that it seems that the Lamanites also adopted this writing culture and had their own records. I think I had a slide where he had a couple of scriptures in it, if you want me to share it with you and to get your thoughts on that.
Okay.
Can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a slide I took from his presentation, and it says Nephite and Lamanite civilizations are fully literate. And Helaman 3:13-15 talks about there being like many records kept of the proceedings of this people by many of this people, and 100th part of the proceedings of this people. Yeah, they counted the Lamanites and the Nephites and their wars and contentions and dissensions, their preaching, prophecies, and their shipping, and their building of ships, and their building of temples, synagogues, their sanctuaries, righteousness, wickedness, murders, robbings, and their plundering. All manner of abominations and whoredoms cannot be contained in this work. There are many books and many records of every kind kept chiefly by the Nephites. And so I think he would say that there's loads of records, like in Mormon's abridgment, this is just barely 100th part. And yeah, it says it's chiefly been kept by the Nephites, but then also, the Lamanites then is there are people who are not chiefly keeping records as well. And I think in Mosiah, that scripture in 24:4-7, it talks about Amulon. Let's say I'll just read it. It says, King Laman appointed teachers of the brethren of Amulon in every land which was possessed by his people, and thus the language of Nephi began to be taught among all the people of the Lamanites, but they taught them that they should keep the record, that they might write one to another, and thus the Lamanites began to increase in riches and began to trade one with another and wax great. So I think he made the argument that Amulon, he was one of the priests of King Noah, I believe, that joined with the Lamanites, that he would have taken this writing system to the Lamanites and that they started keeping records as well. And I think his argument is that if there were, all the Nephites keeping lots of records and then the Lamanites were as well, should we not see evidence of that? What will be your general response to that? I know some of the records might have been destroyed, at the end of the Book of Mormon. But what are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's several, and they're kind of layers of pieces of information. Let's start with the very first one.
Sorry.
So let's say that the Nephites are writing, and now we have Lamanites and they're writing. Would the Lamanites have had exactly the same thing that the Nephites did? Not necessarily. Let's say that the Nephites are all Maya and they're writing in Maya script. Could they write a letter? Absolutely. There's nothing in the Maya script that would prevent them from writing a letter. So this idea that the Lamanites, have to have exactly the same writing system as the Nephites, not a requirement. Now, they certainly have to be able to read each other's, and that's a different question. But the idea that they had the writing. Yeah, of course they did. They were writing at this time period. We know that writing was there. So that's not a surprise. Are there lots of records? Without looking at what the Nephites did, and the Nephites claim to be great record keepers, although we, have only one record from them. But did the Lamanites, did the Maya, did these other people keep records? Absolutely. And yes, most of them were destroyed, so we don't know, what they were like. But at the time of conquest, we have a couple of texts that were written down that said that they were remembering or reading these documents, and the Popol Vuh is one of them, where it says, we're writing this, and we're, basically taking it from our native text, and this is what it said. And so you go through that, and you'll say, okay, well, and I remember he specifically talked about the Popol Vuh, and he said, this is a mythical text. Well, it is at the beginning, but then it turns to history.
Right. So I was going to bring that up because I have been saying that it's more like mythical or it's cosmic fact, and this comes from the oral culture. It's not a historical record like the Book of Mormon.
Yeah, until you get past the mythical stuff. And so you go back to the Bible and you'll say, okay, well, this is oral tradition that has been codified, and now we're getting, writing in the Old Testament. Well, yeah, the same kind of thing. You have in the Popol Vuh, you have the oral sections or the mythological section. This is where we come from. This is our origin. Okay, here's history. This is what the history is. And you've got them in the very same text, and it's not surprising, and they could write anything they wanted to in history. And we have other texts from that time period that do the same kind of thing. The title of the Lords of Totonicapán and the Annals of the Caxical, all of those are talking about historical information. So yeah, they could write them. Now let's
and do you know to what comparison, sorry, Brant, would be like the length of the Popol Vuh? Like how long sort of like a history would that be, in comparison to like say something like the gold plates?
It certainly isn't as long. The Mormon's book is a remarkably long book. And it is, I think, for that time period of anything that's being written, it would be an outlier. It would be longer than most things that were written. Right. But again, not that it's not possible to do it. It's just, this is on the outside. This is a very large book. But Popol Vuh is still, reasonably large text. These other books are reasonably large texts. So the idea that, you couldn't write it is demonstrably incorrect. They could write anything they wanted to, and they did want to write history frequently. And we get some of that history in the glyphic stone texts, but we also get them as they have been written down in a later Maya language at the time of the conquest, written down in the Roman script. So we have a lot more of them.
Was the Popol Vuh, I should probably know this, was that the Mayans or the Aztecs?
Yeah, it's the Maya, and in particular, it's the Quiche Maya. But the reason, there's two things about it that are really important. One is, it is the most complete text that we have for the Maya worldview of how they started, what their mythology of the origin of the world was. And it's really, really important for that. But the other reason it's important is it's not just the Quiche Maya. They are finding elements of that story, the pictographic, the artistic representations of elements of that story are widespread throughout Mesoamerica, go much deeper in both culture and time. So the Popol Vuh becomes almost our Rosetta Stone for understanding a lot of other things that we're seeing in the Maya world that don't have texts with them, but the pictures tell a story, and that story is told in the Popol Vuh. And because of that, we can start to learn how to read some of these pictures that don't have texts that come from a much earlier time. So it's very, very important for that. But for that very reason, we don't often talk about the historical section. So it's very easy to say, oh yeah, this is mythology. Well, only part of it. They tell the mythologies, and then they get into saying, okay, now this is our story. And then they tell history. And it's history that is frankly, much later, because the people that it's telling history of are much later. But we know how to read some of it. They talk about what's called the Western Lords, and the Western Lords are coming from central Mexico, And that's another thing that's kind of interesting, just as a side note about, how do you understand texts in history? If we look at a map and we look at, where Guatemala is, it is for us south of Mexico City. Well, they keep calling the people from Mexico City the Western wards. Why is that? Well, because they arrived from the West, because they came down the coast and then they had to turn and go inland. And so they're coming in on basically the road is coming in from the West. So they don't have this worldview that the rest of us do about these big maps. They just know that these guys came in from the West. Well, we know that they happen to be, northwest and more north than west. But still, that's the way they're treated in the text. Now, the next thing I want to say about layers of text is the one on the right, where it says that they, teach the Nephite language, and then everybody's going to learn how to read and write.
Wait, can I ask you a wee question before you?
Oh, yeah, go.
It's to do with the Popol Vuh, because I don't know too much about this. Would you know offhand what might be like the percentage between the sort of like mythology in it that maybe came from the oral culture, and then how much might be history, or like a rough sort of ratio between the two?
Oh, in the Popol Vuh?
Yeah.
Ballpark of half and half.
About half. So you're saying that when he said that all sort of like Mesoamerican writing or like the Popol Vuh record, it's not just strictly, cosmic or mythology or oral, but also represents literate society and culture and containing some of their history.
Yeah, and the idea that literacy replaces all of this is, again, that's too fine a line to draw.
As in, like, they're either fully oral or fully literate. No, you did talk about secondary orality. Would he view that they were in that, that was sort of like the society they were in at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, we know that the Maya were a literate society, and then when he talks about people dancing the rituals, yeah, they did that. That was that's part of their political religious system, is the king is going to be dancing things.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of these performance related things. So yeah, that part of it's true. But they're also literate, and they could write anything they wanted to write, and we know they wrote history. So again, drawing too fine a line here obscures the real history, which is all of these things kind of exist together, and things move in different parts, and they have different reasons. And because the Nephites are not the Maya, the fact that the Maya did something doesn't mean that the Nephites had to have done exactly what the Maya did. We see elements, we can see parts of the cultural evidence of the region in the Book of Mormon, but the Book of Mormon does not replicate Maya culture. It will indicate that it understands it and somehow it's influenced there. But they're not the same and shouldn't be the same, and we should not expect they're the same. We should not, for example, go to Rome and say, here's what Rome is like, and because Jerusalem doesn't look like Rome, Jerusalem couldn't have existed. It's not the right argument. And of course, there's scale there that's much different than the Book of Mormon, but the idea is the same thing. Just because there is a massive cultural influence doesn't mean that everybody is part of that cultural influence. So what I wanted to go back to was this one in Mosiah 24, though, because it's talking about the Nephites teaching the writing. As an historian who reads ancient texts, you read that, and the first thing I think of is, that didn't actually happen. And that sort of bumps up against the problem of how do you read a religious text. And the assumption is that, because it's a religious text and we say that it's true, therefore everything in it is absolute correct, and that's exactly the way things happen. Well, human beings wrote this, and human beings are subject to the way that we talk about things. And statements like this, where, we caused them to be like us, that's a very egocentric and ethnocentric view of the world, and hardly surprising at all, rarely true. So, you look at something like that and you go, okay, I know where that culture came from. I know where the statement came from. But I'm not surprised at all to find out that before this happened, that the Lamanites were already writing. Not shocking in the least, based on the way a human being would have written their own text at that time period. And there was one other one I was going to talk about, which is, these layerings of pieces of information.
Can I ask you a question on that? When it says in that verse about Amulon, sort of bringing, the Nephite writing system, their language, to the Lamanites and that they can also keep records. Are you saying that you don't believe that the Lamanites actually were keeping records, maybe not like as long as the Nephites, but like in a similar way?
I'm sure they were. I'm sure they were keeping records. Now, this may refer to the fact that they taught them how to read a Nephite record. That's certainly a possibility. They may have influenced something about, how the record is kept. But the idea that they kept records at all, or that the Nephites taught them how to write, no, didn't. That's not historical. That is the way history is written by a certain society. Everybody, the ethnocentric societies tend to.
So they're trying to take the credit for them writing.
Yeah, of course. I mean, and this happens a lot. If you look at the Book of Mormon, when it talks about Lamanites, it always talks about them being wild people and uncivilized people. Yeah. And then you look at what happens when the sons of Mosiah go to Lamanite territory, and you find out, oh, wait a minute. No, this is actually a pretty complex civilization. They've got kings over kings, and the Nephites don't seem to have that. So there's much more complexity going on. There's a lot bigger civilization. Lots of things are happening, but the Nephites are still going to say, oh, yeah, those are barbarians. They're not civilized like we are. Well,
that was actually one of my favorite parts of your book, was reading through that as well, because you take everything, like very literally what the Nephites are saying about the Lamanites, and you have this view that they're just wild savages who are, very tribal. And you're right, like when you look more in depth at, particularly when Alma and the sons of Mosiah go to see King Lamoni.
And so what you have here are stereotypes, and the idea that a people will stereotype the other is just common in world literature. It's just all over the place. The Greek term barbarian comes from the fact that the barba, the beard, the other cultures had beards and the Greeks didn't. And so they talked about the barbarians, these other people. And of course, they're not nearly as civilized as the Greeks who, shave and do all these wonderful things. Well, they had other cultures that were good, that did other kinds of things, but not if you read Greek literature. The Greeks are the best. Well, this is humanity. Now, the other one that's really interesting here, though, when you go back to the Helaman one, let's see, where was it in there? Yeah, it's up near the top. It says, behold, 100th part of the proceeding of this people, yea, the account of them is. Basically, it says we can't write everything that they're doing. You only get 100th part.
Do you think it's literally 100th part? Do you think it's a figure of speech?
Here's the interesting thing. The idea that you cannot write but a little is common to incipient literacy. We can't write everything like we used to be able to tell you everything. And so the assumption was that if you wrote something down, it was a distillation in a smaller 100th part. If you'll take that, terminology, it's a smaller part of what you could have said.
Right.
And so it's always smaller. And so there are people, as they are writing, who complain in the writing process that they can't write everything. And it's a typical complaint that you get in the old world in incipient literacy, where the people are writing and they're saying, and I can't write everything. And it's because it's still a heavily oral tradition. And they have this oral mindset that the real world is oral, and this artificial smaller world is what's being written. And so that marker, fascinatingly enough, is another thing that says to me right immediately that, the Book of Mormon is in an incipient literate culture. Most of the people are still oral because we're getting this complaint. And it's not, I'm telling you that, I just can't write down everything that they did. This is a complaint saying, other ways of communicating can tell you everything. I'm dealing in something that's small. And you get, is it Nephi or also Mormon or Moroni? Anyway, talks about not being mighty in writing like I am in speaking.
Yeah, that's right.
That's your oral and literate. The speaking world is still powerful. The written word is not. So that's kind of one of these other markers that says the text itself is coming from a population that is learning literacy. And back to what Dr. Lundwall was saying, he's saying that you shouldn't have this kind of literacy. Well, we don't have the literacy that he is saying is there. So he's saying the Book of Mormon requires like a full 100% literacy, and it doesn't. And the text itself denies that, even when, as he points out, it talks about reading all the time. But if you read carefully, there are places where it says, yes, he read the scriptures, but he could not have read the scriptures. And you and I were talking a little earlier, and I was using the analogy of the blind person that says, oh, I see that. The blind person doesn't see, but the language has this information in it about how you talk about things. And so, someone who is blind, it doesn't surprise them at all to say, oh, I can see that argument. It's just the way you would talk about it. And so it's natural, and particularly if with the translator being Joseph in a very literate culture, it's not surprising at all that he says read rather than recite from memory, because Joseph wouldn't have been familiar with that method at all. But if you look at the situations and where they occur, you could not have had a text to read from, so you have to be going from memory.
Because I think they might argue that that they might agree with you that they wouldn't have had all these texts, but they might argue that Joseph Smith might have believed that these ancient people, I think he believed that Genesis was literal history, and that it was written by those ancient authors. And we'll maybe talk about this point later when it comes to Adam writing a genealogy and a record, and then Abraham and such. But I think they would say that is this maybe Joseph Smith, if he's the author and he's saying that some of these people were reading from the scriptures because that's his sort of perception or assumption of they would have been very literate in that way.
Yeah, and what I would say is that it is not surprising at all that Joseph would say that. I would say that Joseph, as a translator, certainly would put in those terms about, here's all the reading that's being done. But then I would say if you start looking at the text starts talking about all kinds of things that Joseph did not know, would not have understood, elements of the text that he would not have known how to put together, these elements of orality. It was a different kind of orality in Joseph's day than what you get in these ancient texts. So yeah, I think Joseph, as a person from the 19th century, influenced some of the language that we have in the Book of Mormon, but on the English level, not on the level of the information that it communicates. Okay.
And to put a fine point on this section, because he was making the argument in his video that if there's these people that came over, and then Nephi became king, and then there were Lamanite kings. So even if they were among sort of like the Mayan civilization, that if they had this advanced writing system, it would have transformed the civilization and the culture that everyone else would have been writing, and that we should see evidence of these records. They might say, why has this all disappeared, all these records? And that, and I know we touched on this, but that the majority of Mayan writing was secondary orality. Now you're arguing the Popal Vuh had more history to it, but what would be your response to that we should see a lot more of these records?
Yeah, and the very first thing that I would say is the assumption that what the Nephites were doing should have influenced everybody else and changed their culture. That is a mistaken line to draw. That's the assumption that their method of writing could do things that the other methods of writing could not. And there is no evidence for that at all. There is evidence, of course, that there was a tradition of writing sermons that comes from the old world, and we don't necessarily get sermon culture among the Maya that we are aware of. Or certainly the sermons that we have from them are very different. But that doesn't mean that it should have or would have. And this is where we're talking about Jared Diamond's information about innovations dying out. The fact that it's an innovation and was really important somewhere else doesn't mean that it's going to be here. And just the fact of writing was always concentrated in Mesoamerica and never diffused farther than that. So it never went south into South America. It never went north, and didn't even make it into Mexico City. So the whole idea of what should have happened, we've got a lot of what actually happened that can show that the assumption is incorrect based on what we know from the history of that area.
Right, and you were saying before that in Israel or in Jerusalem, it was a relatively small percentage of people that would have been trained in writing it. And would you believe it would be the same in the Book of Mormon?
I think the highest I've seen for ancient Israel that most people would accept is in the ballpark of 18% literacy, and that was probably higher than Egypt or Babylon. But by the time you get to the New World, we really don't have information to know. But if it were 18%, I would be surprised. It would probably fall, I would guess, 10 to 12% literacy, just based on again, what the other cultures were doing. It was limited to the upper class and a certain trained group of people. And, the places where we get most of the writing are, with trained scribes who are, writing down the acts of the kings. So that's very much what most political writing is about. And that's what these large plates of Nephi say they are. So yeah, that fits in with minimal literacy.
Okay, I'm gonna unshare this slide. I'm gonna get you back on. There we go. So another question I had. So then when he talked about like, oh, the Book of Mormon has, there's sermons, it's got histories, letters, things like that. Like after King Benjamin's speech said that, they'll write it down, and we touched on that. And he's saying that other Mesoamerican writing wouldn't have resembled that, but you're saying that that could have been brought with them from Jerusalem. That sort of
there's certainly a lot of what we have in the Book of Mormon that looks very much like the Bible, and the reason is very obviously because it intentionally imitates what was happening in the Bible.
And they claim to have the brass plates with them as well.
Yeah, the brass plates were there as an example. People were trained in how to read it, so they had the examples of these things. The examples of what to do with sermons, prophecies, all these writings, they were all there. And so that's not a surprising thing for the Nephites. Now, again, why doesn't it happen in other cultures? Well, that is the assumption that it should have if it was an innovation. And that's the point where, we look again at other cultures, and even within Mesoamerica, these things don't necessarily diffuse. So the argument that it should have, okay, you can say, I think it should have, but there is no empirical evidence that said that it would have. And so not finding it is not surprising, because we have that problem in lots of places. Again, the Maya writing system could write anything it wanted to and never diffused outside of that general area.
Okay, that's pretty important.
Yeah, I mean, again,
what I was getting from what he was saying is that, oh no, if any sort of people came into a culture and that they were literate, that the culture, their society would have transformed into fully literate, because it's like a more advanced technology. That's kind of like what I was getting from what he was saying, but you're saying that's not always been the case.
And that advanced technology concept is one where most of the linguists would look at it and say, yeah, no, the idea that a certain kind of writing system is inherently superior. Chinese has been using its logographic symbols for a very long time, and they can write anything they would like to write in them. They've never developed nor used nor cared about an alphabetic writing system. And, China's been around for a long time. China's around now. China's still using that way of writing to write everything in that we would look at now. So the whole idea that the syllabic or the alphabetic nature of writing is going to be a transformative thing, it just doesn't work in history. It works in limited spaces and works best if you're in Europe. It doesn't work very well when you get to the Far East or the Americas. So the assumption that it should have been a revolution is demonstrably untrue, based on what we know of actual world history.
Okay. And just to put one final point on this, just to make sure that I fully get it, and maybe my listeners as well, because in his presentation, he has almost like there's like oral societies, oral culture, and it's very much like myth, ritual, dance, like cosmology, so not like literal history. Then there's like secondary orality, which still has the oral culture, but then writing sort of used to like support that. So the writings might have like reflected still that oral culture. Then there's like fully literate, that's more like, literal history, writing their religions, say sermons and things like that. And he's saying that the Mayan were in the middle, more like secondary orality. The Nephites were like fully literate and therefore out of time and place. What is sort of like your very quick response to that in summing what you've been saying?
Very first thing is that the lines are drawn incorrectly. The idea that there is some line between, oral, and oral must include this, and when you move to this, you drop that and only include this. Those fine lines and definitions are incorrect based on history. You have people repeating myth today that are in a fully literate society, and they still will repeat certain kinds of myths.
Well, I see that at church because somebody said something which I knew was just sort of like oral tradition, passed down. It was about Joseph Smith and people accusing him of being a treasure digger, and how this was, just lies told from the beginning. And then he said, like, and that's what ended up bringing him to Carthage jail. That's what led to him being killed. And I remember I sat there and I was like, I'm sure I'd heard that growing up. And I grew up in a ward that was just, very orthodox, fundamentalist, don't really do their research. And I was like, so much of this is wrong. And even when about polygamy, people would say like it was to take care of the widows, and there was more women than men, all these things which like we just repeat because we've heard them from somebody said it before, but it's not factually true.
Yeah, we have our own myths that we perpetuate. And if you look at any population, you'll find that the stories that you tell about yourselves are always much more complimentary than the ones you tell about the outsiders. This is just nature. Doesn't matter who you are. So my first impression, of course, is that these ideas of the dividing lines and what goes where, it's not that clean. It's not that clean at all. For example, we still have the Maya storytellers who will tell a lot of stories, and they're living inside a fully literate culture, but they still tell their stories. They still have a lot of elements of morality. Interestingly enough, the Maya storytellers, and I'm trying to remember what the context is, and now I'm forgetting it. There's a particular context in which chiasm shows up in Maya oral presentations. But it's a particular context where it's like sacred things or something that you'll get these chiastic texts. And again, it's skipping me, but anyway. But they've collected a lot of the Maya oral literature, and it has these elements of orality in it, and they're still getting passed down. Well, this is today. This is not a people who've never heard about writing. This is not a people who don't know. Frankly, most of them are going to know at least 2 languages, and they'll read and write in Spanish and may or may not read into their native language. But all of these things, the stories they tell, they persist.
So still to preserve this orality.
The dividing lines are not that clean. And so, what about the Book of Mormon? How does that fit in? Well, the Book of Mormon is a transitional text. It has elements of orality in it, even though it talks about being a very literate document and being pulled from a literate document. You still see elements of orality in it. So again, the line for the Book of Mormon, I think he has drawn incorrectly. So basically, it's these separate boxes that he's created that really aren't supposed to be that separate. And then he's created a box for the Book of Mormon where it doesn't fit.
Right. And when he says the Mayan religion was more like ritual or dance versus like, preaching and sermons, what would you say to that?
Well, I mean, everybody has certain elements of ritual, and they develop culturally over time. And we don't know what ritual existed in the Nephite churches. We know that they sang, but that's not surprising.
No.
We know that in the development of Christianity, the nature of ritual has shifted a lot over time. Protestant ritual is very different from Catholic ritual. Eastern Orthodox has other developments, and the older you go, the more performative the ritual is. The newer you go, the less they move away from the performative, and the rituals are kind of toned down. But it doesn't go away. You just change the nature of your ritual. You go to virtually any Latter-day Saint chapel and listen to the prayers. And if it's an English-speaking ward, you're going to hear certain phrases repeated no matter where you are in the ward in the world, because this is how we pray. These are the words that we tend to use. And it will get shocking if you are, let's say, a Utah Mormon, and you go somewhere else, and you have someone who comes from a Baptist tradition, and you start getting some of their phrases in the prayers, and you go, hold on, wait a second. You're not saying that right. So we end up with our own tradition. We just don't call it that. We don't recognize them because we live within them. But we have our own traditions. We have things that we do and we don't do. And sometimes there were traditions that got started somewhere, and then someone officially said, yeah, you don't really need to do that. I don't know if you ever saw people passing the sacrament where they would, have the sacrament trays in the right hand, and the left hand was put very formally behind the back.
Yes, yeah, I had seen that in some of the words I'd
that was passed around for a while. Somebody thought that was cool, and so that developed as a tradition. And then the church officials said, "Don't do that anymore." You still see it.
Yeah, right.
It hasn't gone away, but it's been officially said, "Yeah, that's not part of it. That's more formal than we wanted it to be."
Yeah, each ward has their own system of this is the way that you do it.
But yeah, I mean, we don't dance our rituals, but we do a ritual dance of another kind.
And so when he would say, like, I think he would say, like, oh, if this was a historical text, then you should see the Nephites, dancing their religion or their ritual, or there should be more chants or things like it. It sounds very much like, say, 19th century sermons and preaching. What would you say that? Would you say that they're maybe influenced by what they were experiencing in the old world and bringing that with them?
A lot of that is the heritage that comes with it. A lot of that is that you have a revelation, a very strong revelation of the atoning Messiah coming in very early, and the Book of Mormon uses the term Christ and Jesus the Christ. But I think that's sort of modern language that's been put onto a text, because the Book of Mormon uses both Messiah and Christ.
Right.
And they both mean the same thing, but they're coming from one Hebrew and one Greek. So it's.
I remember reading in your book as well about Old Testament scholar Margaret Barker, who talked about temple Israelite tradition that they had before like Josiah's reform, and that there was like in the temple tradition, there was Jehovah, but he had a father, and that there was Asherah, but also like there was this belief about like an atoning Messiah, and that was then taken away with Josiah's reforms.
That appears to be when Nephi says that he's going to be restoring things that were lost to the scriptures,
clean and precious truth, and we all think about that happened way after.
Yeah, one of the we think it is, because that's the way we think of it. We think of somebody's taken that away and we have to put it back, and there's actually very little evidence of that kind of thing happening en masse.
Yeah, like conspiring men who have like translators who remove lots of parts.
But if Nephi says he's going to be restoring something, what does he spend his time talking about? Well, the only thing he talks about that is a restoration of something is this idea of the atoning Messiah. So when Nephi says, these guys have lost something and I want to bring it back, it's this atoning Messiah, because that's his message.
Because Locke would say like that's anachronistic, or this is a clear 19th century element. Like, why is it talking about Jesus Christ, before Christ comes? I thought that was really interesting that ancient Israelites would have had this tradition of a atoning Messiah in the temple tradition before Josiah's reforms.
It was being sort of, you had a dual tradition of an atoning Messiah and a triumphant Messiah, and the triumphant Messiah is more the political ruler, and that started getting emphasized. As soon as you've got a king, you have to aggrandize the king. So the more you have ancient Israel moving to this kingship and this centralized society, the more that happens, the more their literature is now emphasizing the king, and it moves away from the atoning Messiah into the triumphal Messiah, which gets associated with the king. And because of that political influence, that is pulling the religion along with it, and that's where this divide happens, and that's why you start to lose that part of it. And when you look at Nephi, they're not Nephi, Lehi. What does Lehi teach that he thinks that they ought to know? He teaches this atoning Messiah. So from the very beginning of the Book of Mormon, the atoning Messiah is the message.
Yeah.
And it isn't foreign to that time period, but it was disappearing. And then what's happened is the Book of Mormon says, we need to bring this back. Well, when it gets translated into English, of course, it becomes Jesus Christ, because he is that personage. And because the name is being used that early, then it seems anachronistic. But the concept of teaching an atoning Messiah was not really anachronistic. It's just that it was dying out of Israelite culture, and Lehi and Nephi want to re-emphasize that with their new people.
And the writing of a lot of the books in the Old Testament that, don't, there's some references that, we'd read maybe in Isaiah, prophesying of, Christ, the suffering servant and such. But would a lot of the books in the Bible as we would have it, in the Pentateuch, would they have been written sort of after this reform would have happened, which is why maybe we don't see any clear references to the atoning Messiah?
No, there's a difference between written and edited and redacted.
Right,
and,
right, yeah.
You get that throughout all of the scriptures. Any of them that have been around for a while
that's sort of more my question, like edited or sort of like redacted or revised.
Yeah, and you don't get the idea that these are immutable sacred texts until much later.
Right.
Where they make, the Masoretes make sure they have these, excellent copies of them. That comes much later. The earlier on appears to have changed things a lot more. So yeah, it just depends on, what gets written. And of course, we don't have everything that they wrote. We have what was preserved. And what is preserved is, what's written by the priesthood that is now associated with the king. And so there's been shifts in the way religion is performed. And part of the reforms of Hezekiah and then later Josiah were to start trying to centralize religious beliefs rather than the decentralized.
Right.
Every has their own. They're trying to pull it all together, and so that caused a lot of those shifts, which is why they're trying to get rid of basically all the high places, because that's where each of the individual groups would go to worship, and they wanted everybody centralizing worship in Jerusalem.
Right, one temple in Jerusalem, right.
Which is pretty far away from the topic we started on, just so you know.
Yes. Well, okay. So I want to ask a few questions. Continue with sort of like some of the anachronisms that he pointed to in his presentation. So, okay, let's talk about the brass plates. I often hear critics talk about how the brass plates are anachronistic, and the brass plates I would view as very core, very central to like the Book of Mormon narrative. Like I feel like there had to have been a literal brass plates record that they brought with them, and they would say them having like the first 5 books of Moses and the writings of the prophets from the creation, Isaiah up until like Zedekiah being on there. And they would say that some biblical scholars would say that is this anachronistic? Would there have been these records of all of these books being on these brass plates in Jerusalem? What's your thoughts on that? Like what's the possibility or probability of there being brass plates?
Well, yeah, you've got 2 or 3 different things going on here. So let's start with the books themselves. Would the books themselves have existed and, be collected as a single thing? You probably not very often. The books are going to exist.
Would have been like separate scrolls, wouldn't they be?
Yeah, you're going to put them on separate scrolls because you don't have anything that's big enough to put them all together. So, you're going to have separate scrolls for each book. How about all of the books existing? Well, you can argue about things like Deuteronomy, but when you refer to they contain the 5 books of Moses, I see that as again a literary statement rather than a statement of context, because the Book of Mormon doesn't necessarily define what books they are, how many of them are. So it's got the record, but it also clearly has something else. So you get Zenock and Zenos in there, and we don't know who they are. Well, it's because it's coming from a different tradition, it's a different collection. So would the books have been there? Yeah, you can make a good argument that the books would be there. Now you go to plates. The plates is definitely unusual. Having a lot of records on plates is going to be very strange. And the reason why logically they would fit into the Book of Mormon is they're coming out of Egypt and from Joseph. And it says this is basically a tribal record coming from Joseph. Well, Joseph had the wherewithal to be able to make plates. And in the ancient world, the places where we have found the plates have had very important writings on them. You did things you wanted to preserve. Important things would be on the plates. And there are more records of these plates than there are artifacts. In other words, we have documents where plates are being discussed and talked about, but we don't have the examples.
Right, we don't have the plates themselves.
Texts that refer to them to let us know that they were there. We have those. So if it's coming out of Egypt, it's coming out of a place where somebody could command the resources to make the plates. And then if you put them together, it is definitely an outlier, but not something where you say, yeah, there's no precedent for this whatsoever. Yes, there is precedent. So yes, we could have had the books. Yes, they could have been a collection. And the tie back to Joseph of Egypt, who had the wherewithal, to make them and create them, and create blank pages, which again is from the evidence in the Book of Mormon. Blank pages were created. So all of that says, yeah, that it's plausible. It fits into a possible context. And, do we have anything that is an exact exemplar of that? No. Do we have things that are pretty close that let you know that it was there? Yeah. And then do we have texts that talk about something that's closer? Yes, those texts exist as well. So I don't see a problem with the brass plates. They could have existed. They would have been an outlier. They would have been, kept separate from everything else. The fact that they're being kept in a treasury, tells us that these are not common and are not understood to be common. So, the story fits. It does not bump up against a difficult historical wall.
Okay. So one of the arguments he made in his video was that Joseph Smith, assuming he's the author and it's not a translation of an ancient text, assumed that a lot of these ancient people were literate and would have kept records. And I remember he had a slide, I can bring it up, but it talked about how Adam kept a record, in the Book of Moses. Abraham saying that he had the writings of some of the patriarchs from the beginning of the world. The Jaredites as well, that they would have came around 2200 BCE. I don't know if you agree with that dating over to the Promised Land. And then they also had a record. And I think Jared talks about that he is writing about from the beginning of the world. I'll maybe get the slide up just so I'm not misquoting. And he's saying that those people wouldn't have been fully literate, back in that time. And that's Joseph Smith's
there's
assumption.
two parts to that. And let's start with the people of Jared. The people of Jared are coming late enough in history that they're going to be coming out of a literate society. So the fact that they would keep a record is no stranger than the Nephites keeping a record. They're coming from peoples who have language, who have literature. As long as they've got someone trained to write, they're going to be able to keep the records in the language. So that is not surprising.
Because writing would have existed when the Jaredites came, but because I think he would say there was mostly an oral culture at that time, but there would have been some.
And again, that's back to his assumption that if there's writing, it's going to diffuse and create a revolution, which the assumption is incorrect. Okay. So the assumption that couldn't be there because this is what it should have done, the should have done part is wrong. So the Book of Jared, not a problem. The brass plates, to have had information on them at that point in time, not a surprise, coming out of the tradition. Now, I think that they're going to have to be written much later than Joseph, to have, you can have very different forms of things on them. Now, when you get to the Book of Moses and it's saying that they have a record, I think that's Joseph interpolating, his ideas. And in this case, it would not surprise me that he says they wrote and kept a record, and the record they kept was oral and not written. You certainly, at the time of Adam, are not going to have, well, depending on when you put Adam, but having Adam keep a very accurate record would be surprising, but not surprising that Joseph would write it that way.
Right, because he would say, because it does say that Adam did write and keep a record in his language, and you're saying that probably would not have existed at that time.
And if it weren't for the fact that Moses is known to be a prophetic translation, in other words, there's no text that he was working from that we know about. But if that came as a pseudepigraphal record from, let's say, 600 or 700 BC, let's make it 800 BC. What if that statement had been there? It would not be surprising at all, because one of the things that tends to happen as you write is that you take what you are and push it back in time. It's called presentism, and so we assume that everybody before us is just like we are. So it doesn't surprise me that that's there. I don't think that requires it to be historical. And if you want to say that Joseph is the one who's behind that language, I wouldn't be unhappy with that. But if you wanted to say that was language that somebody else wrote down, that would be consistent with the way they would have written it, in an earlier time period. Does that mean it was correct? No, it just means that that's what they thought was correct.
Right. So you're saying that the Book of Moses, it could have been, because I think when I talk about it with Blake, somewhat of a revelatory expansion, but you're thinking it could have also been a translation of like a pseudepigraphical sort of text about Moses, containing
However
some of
you
this.
look at it, what I'm saying is, if there were a pseudepigraphal text, if this had nothing to do with Joseph Smith at all, if there was a pseudepigraphal text that said this,
Mm-hmm.
and Joseph had nothing to do with it, if we had an authentic ancient text and it said that, I would agree that it would said that. I would have believed that it said that. I would not believe that Adam wrote, because this is simply the presentism of the writer, inferring what should have happened in an earlier time. And of course, we're going to assume that Adam is, just like the best of us. So that does not surprise me at all. And again, you'll obviously find that I'm not a literalist in the way that I, read these texts. I don't read them assuming that every single word here is exactly what happened, because I read them as an historian, and I read them as a text coming from the ancient world, and all of these kinds of things show up in the ancient world. So, they're not surprising at all.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
and
I've
that
got a
doesn't
question.
mean that they're not, talking about history. It just means that everything they write does not. It's just like we were talking about, the Nephites teaching the Lamanites to write, or with their stereotyping of the Lamanites. And that may be a better one. They keep talking about the Lamanites and how they're uncivilized, and yet they go there and they talk about a civilized people, and that's a direct contrast to the stereotype. But the stereotype is still there, and that's what happens in ancient literature. We have these ways that we refer to things. It doesn't mean that they aren't writing history. It just means that every single thing they say about history is not necessarily historical.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I've got a question going back to the Jaredites and the Book of Ether. And I think I asked you about the Tower of Babel in, I think, one of our first interviews. But a question I have about that, because scholars would say that the Tower of Babel is a myth, it's not literal history, probably influenced by like Babylonian, oral traditions and origin myths. And then if the Jaredites in the Book of Ether, if they claim that Jared and the Jaredites came from, well, I think it says the Great Tower, it doesn't say the Tower of Babel, but that's sort of like the understanding that we've all had. Joseph Smith wrote they came from the Tower of Babel when the languages were confounded. But that's sort of myth. Critics might say, oh, well, the whole Jaredite story is built off a myth, so it's non-historical. And I've heard some faithful scholars saying, well, this could have been either, Moroni or Mosiah when they, well, I think Mosiah translated it, is that correct? And then Moroni abridged it. Or am I getting that wrong? I can't remember.
No, you get it right.
I'm getting it right.
That's the way it appears to have happened, yeah.
And then Ether's the one who wrote it, so perhaps it could have been one of them responsible for the origin myth. But one of the questions I had about that is, because whenever I listen to some Bible scholars talking about when sort of like this these origin myth stories about the Tower of Babel probably came around maybe 7th or 8th century BC, which would have been after the Jaredites would have came. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So like who do we attribute this to? Is it is it Mosiah? Is it Moroni? Is it Joseph Smith?
Well, let's start with history. Is there any historical evidence of an incident of a Tower of Babel where all languages split off and were created at that moment in time? The answer is no. There's zero evidence of that. We have languages long before that. We have languages developing and much more widespread. That is a story,
and to my old fundamentalist, very traditional Orthodox self, that's quite devastating you saying that, because I think most of my ward would view those opening chapters of Genesis as this is literal history.
Yeah, and most people, and again, we're coming from a religious tradition where, believing the literal Bible, the Bible to be literally correct in every single thing it says. There's a long tradition of that.
Yeah. And yeah, prophets as well, and Joseph Smith, I think you could probably argue as well.
So the idea is not, even in the article of faith, it says, we believe the book or the Bible as far as it's translated correctly, because there are things in it that are not correct, and it's gone through all these processes. And that's not necessarily talking about the language translation. Joseph is using a different concept there. But, again, to go back to history, was there that element? No, there wasn't. So how does that get into the Book of Ether? Well, what it says is, as Mosiah is translating, and he may have translated it, and then Moroni is looking, he says, there's a whole bunch of stuff at the beginning that we already have in our Bible. Oh, well, wait a minute. So he's recognizing things that are coming from the brass plates. And so he's not telling us what was there. He's saying, this is the stuff that you don't have to know about. And so Moroni is summarizing it. So what happens with, Mosiah? Well, Mosiah also has the brass plates and has this information on it, all of which is coming much later than the Jaredites. And so he translates and he says, yeah, I know what that story is. Here's the story. So I think, again, what you're getting is multiple odd translations of things where it's taking Mosiah, who translated according to what he thought it was referring to, and then Moroni gets that third hand. So I don't see that as being original to Ether at all. It's part of what Moroni says, yeah, well, this is just the collective stuff that we're not interested in. So, it's a shorthand reference. It talks about coming from, the tower, and, how all of this gets together, I'm not exactly sure, but that part of it is not even given as a translation, a direct translation. It's a summary. And so we don't know who's summarizing it or why. But yeah, I don't see that as a problem.
Okay.
I would see it more of a problem if I had to believe that all languages came from the Tower of Babel, which, is demonstrably incorrect. So,
what would you say? Because I could see maybe a critic or an ex-Mormon saying that, like, oh, well, if Mosiah was translating, the record of the Jaredites, the record of Ether, shouldn't he, if he was doing it, by, say, the gift and power of God, shouldn't it have been very accurate? So why would this origin myth story of them coming from, say, the Tower of Babel, maybe he was translating it and saw something similar, but why would he get that wrong, so to speak?
And all of that goes back to sort of assumptions that we bring to the questions that we ask. We assume that if it's going to happen by revelation, that it must be perfect, because we have all of these definitions that, again, we bring to the question. But when we actually look at what we have and how we get the information, we look at, and one of the best ways to see that process is to look at the changes that have happened in the revelations and Doctrine and Covenants. There's no pre-text. There's no text that's being translated there. This is revelation. And what happens is the revelation comes and it gets written down, and then Joseph will look at it and he'll say, that didn't explain it well enough. I know more about that and I need to add. And so he would put a new paragraph in or something that explains it. So the actual process of receiving revelation, of translation, how all of that worked, if you actually look at it, it's more human and messier than the assumption that we bring, which is, oh, God helped the translation, therefore it should be perfect. Well, okay, we have record of how it was happened, and we can take that evidence and look at it, and we can say, this is how it happened. Well, how it happened isn't the way you were thinking. So when you say the way I think it should have been isn't the way it was, that's not much of an argument. It's sort of like saying there can't be a God because the way I think God should be is like this, and God isn't like that, therefore there's no God. Well, that is an argument.
It's your assumptions.
When you begin with the assumption that this is the way I think God should be, or this is the way I think God should act, and then the next statement is, and that isn't happening, then you go back and you say, therefore there's no God. Well, either that or your original assumption is wrong. And, if God were to chime in on this, he says, God would probably say, I think the original assumption was wrong.
And what would be, to put a fine point on this slide, your overall response to somebody who says, it seems like there's a pattern in Joseph Smith's scriptural writings that he's attributing to, Adam in the Book of Moses writing, records. You have the Jaredites, Jar being literate, writing history from the creation of the world, and their sort of generations, their history. Abraham having sort of records of the patriarchs from the creation, and then you got the brass plates, and they might say that this is just coming from Joseph Smith's worldview and assumption that it's all literal history, and that these ancient prophets and peoples were literate, but he was misinformed. And this shows that the Book of Mormon and his other scriptural writings aren't historical, because he's working from this worldview of scripture and this very literal fundamentalist view.
Yeah, I think you could easily make the argument that says Joseph thought that everybody was literate and therefore he wrote it that way. And if you don't look at anything else in the Book of Mormon and you say, therefore, the Book of Mormon, it says it's a record and this is just Joseph's mindset, you could make that argument, except the text has so many other things going for it, where they'll say, well, yeah, that fits, but it doesn't fit well. It's another one of those things where in the literature, they call these things parallelisms, where you start putting these things together. You say, this parallels this and parallels this, and you can stack a whole bunch of parallels up, and it really makes it look like there's an argument there, unless you look at the individual pieces and you go, oh, well, okay, this piece does not fit comfortably with the rest because of this. And so I think when you take those and you treat them as a set, you have parallelomania going on, where you're saying these must mean the same thing, because when you examine them separately, they all have very different explanations behind them. So, yeah, I don't see that as a problem. It sounds really good because it buttresses the assumption that Joseph wrote all of these things himself. But again, it does not lay out all of the information that you would need to know in order to know why those things are or are not parallel.
Okay. Right. Well, we'll finish on this slide. I'll just ask you last couple of questions before we wrap up. I've really been enjoying this discussion and asking some, like, a lot of the questions that I have as well. So I want to get your thoughts on the Caractors document. I did a video on it on my channel, and I think Dr. Lundwall has done an episode on it. However, I've not watched it, so I won't be able to ask you the questions. If you've watched it, you could, if you want to respond to some of the things he was making. But I've heard, some people, well, first of all, we have the John Whitmer documents, and it's disputed. I don't believe this is the same one that was brought to Charles Anton, because it doesn't match the descriptions that Charles Anton gave, but it's believed to be characters that were copied down from the gold plates. But I want to clarify that it doesn't match his descriptions. And some people say, some scholars, whenever I did a video on it, said, oh, it might resemble, maybe some Egyptian hieratic, or, some mixture with maybe Mayan glyphs. And others like, no, this doesn't resemble anything. Some critics would say this is just deformed English. What's your view on the Caractors document?
Well, let me start with the Whitmer document, that is the only one that we really know much about, because we don't know what was on Anthon. And the Whitmer document, it says characters, it does not say text. So we don't know how those characters relate to the text. We just assume that he copied what he saw, and that's a decent assumption. But we don't know for sure, okay? Now, the next thing is Lundwall said that this was a rubbing, and boy, that would be really important if this was a rubbing. A rubbing takes the text that's underneath and you rub like a pencil or something over it, and that will preserve exactly what was there. So wonderful. Well, this isn't a rubbing. This is a rewriting. This is somebody in hand, and you can tell because the size of the characters change and they slope off where somebody's writing, and there's not a lined paper, and you can tell.
That's true. Yeah, that's a good point.
You can tell that this is being written. It isn't a rubbing. So it's not, it's not the exact characters that were there. So then the question that would come up is, how well are they reproduced? And the answer to that is we absolutely have no idea. Now, we assume that they're reproduced pretty well.
Yeah, pretty much identical.
Yeah, but I have seen, for example, you have in the early history of people who were encountering the Maya, you have two artists who reproduced a lot of Maya text. Walbeck, I think it's Walbeck or Waldeck, somebody. Now I'm forgetting the name. And then you have Catherwood. Catherwood is really good. You can see his glyphs and you can read them, and they were good enough that it's not a photograph, boy, you can read them. Walbeck, when he does it, he doesn't really know what he's looking at, so he just sort of generalizes things, and they're sloppy and they don't really look right, and you really couldn't read them. So when you're looking at something that is unfamiliar, how well do you reproduce it? We assume that it's pretty well, but we don't know. What I would assume is that some of those letters are, because they're being written in pen by somebody who is used to certain kinds of letters. I think the flow of the hand may be influenced by what they're used to writing rather than what was on the plates. And all of that is to say, yeah, the curves might have been different. The proportions might have been somewhat different. And does that make a difference? Well, I don't know. In some cases, when you look at the letter and say, oh, that looks like the letter H. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't know what the original looked like. Maybe it really did look like the letter H. It would not be inconceivable that that would happen. But it also may look more like an H because the guy saw it and he said, that looks like an H. So we don't necessarily know. So that's the caveat with the document itself. The document itself, as for usability of saying this is exactly what the script is like, it should be a representation, but we don't really know.
Right.
Second thing is, there is no linguist who's looked at it that says I can read that. Okay. There's no linguist who's looked at it that says that this looks exactly like, anything else. Now there are strokes in it in certain letters that have some appearance of demotic. And I remember somebody coming up with one where they had the letters and they said, here's the demotic letter. And I talked to a professor who is, fluent, but very competent in reading demotic. And he looked at it and he says, well, yeah, if he rotated it this way and turned it upside down and flipped it, then it would be the same character. So yeah, there are some similarities. And if you say, there are similarities, that you can say. If you want to say it's a demotic script, you can't say that. It's not the same. So we can't read it. We don't know what it is. And then when you start reading it and saying, I'm making an assumption based on what I think these symbols mean, you're guessing. So when Lundwall says that this is a logographic script, yeah, he can have that opinion, but I have no idea why he would come up with that, or what he thinks it means and why his idea of the logographic might be different from, let's say, the Hebrew that leaves the vowels out. We just don't know these things. Then what he does, of course, is he starts talking about the later Egyptian grammar that they were playing with, and the idea that they looked at Adamic language and thought it was logographic and everything else. All of that is correct. It just has nothing to do with this particular text. It says, things that somebody thought later when they were looking at Egyptian must be defining what was on this text. And, there's no historical reason for believing that that was possible, nor any indication that there are similarities in the text. So, yeah, the idea that they later came up with this idea, yeah, sure they did, but you can't impute that one backwards. So, unfortunately, with that Caractors document, there's some questions about the characters themselves, exactly how authentic they are, although I do believe they would be representative. I think some of the curves may have been influenced by the writer. They might have been sharp or less. I mean, our own handwriting differs every time we write the same thing. We're not exactly the same. So, when they're copying the characters down, I think they're representative, but may not be precise. But so, then when you get into,
because I think he said in his video that the characters, and I haven't watched the full video, but they're demonstrably falsifiable. So let's just say maybe they're not fully accurate, but they're similar to what was on the gold plates, and he would say that they can be looked at and shown that this is false. That these characters, I think he says this like an alphabetic script, and that they would represent, or they look more like deformed English. I think Dan Vogel had a video on it that he thinks they might have come from some magic parchments or magic books. That I think there's a lot of it's very inconclusive when it comes to it. That was sort of my view on it. You have different people who are saying different things.
Everybody has a different idea, and everybody will find some of the keystrokes that look like some other keystrokes. And there are all kinds of ways to put a stroke on a piece of paper, and you'll find some similarities. There are probably as many to deformed English as they are to reformed Egyptian, to reformed Demotic, or however way you want to do it. Yeah, I think if you're looking for something similar, you'll find something similar. And then, like anything else, when you're saying these two things are similar, it works best if you don't mention the things that aren't.
Right.
And I would say that counts for, Latter-day Saints who look at it and critics who look at it. So it's the same problem for both. It does not copy any known script.
Right.
And it looks like if you pull pieces out, you can find something that looks like that in all kinds of places. And again, that's not necessarily surprising since, humans have been making scratches on things for a long time. At some point in time, we'll come up with the same scratch. But
right. Yeah.
yeah, it does not at the moment represent any language that we know.
Okay.
And looking at it and looking at the characters, I don't know how anyone could just look at the character and say, because that character looks like this, it must be this kind of a writing system. I don't know how you would do that.
So you'd be cautious towards those people who would say the characters are easily falsifiable. You can see that they're a modern invention, or it's deformed English. And also people like, for example, Jerry Grover, who says that, this is like hieratic or demotic, with Mayan glyphs, and he's done a translation. You would also be cautious towards that. I think it's interesting. I want to do an interview with him to talk about it more, but I was extremely cautious in my video to want to promote this, this shows it's authentic, when no other scholars or linguistic experts have verified it.
And I'm not competent to make my own decision on the precise nature of it. I have talked to a couple of linguists who are not convinced.
Right. Gotcha. Okay, so that final couple questions wrapping up in the video. One of the things he said was in the first video was that a tight translation is impossible, which I think you might agree with, but a loose translation is an act of violence. And we've talked about like your translation view being more of like functional, which is, I would probably lean more towards that Joseph Smith is involved as the translator, rendering the translation, his language, his vocabulary, his sort of idiom phrases. That was maybe one part of the video which I maybe didn't think that the arguments were quite as strong, or he dealt with it seriously.
And I'm surprised. I mean, I would expect him to know more about languages and translation than that. But on that particular point, when I wrote the book on the translation of the Book of Mormon and was explaining what my idea was of how it was processed, it was not clearly understood. I've had a lot of people who sort of misunderstood what I was saying. And so I revisited in this next book that's coming out November. But one of the things that was there, that to try to give people an idea of what it's like and what I mean, Alan Christensen speaks Quiche, and he has 2 books that translate the Popol Vuh. In the first book that he translates it reads like English, and it's you're translating it into English. And in the second book, he has what you would call a literal translation from the Quiche, and they're not the same at all. And you read the Quiche, and in certain places you're going, how am I even sure I understand what they're talking about here? Because it's more poetic language. It's because of the nature of their language. There are a lot of ideas that are more condensed than what we need to be able to reproduce them. And so the text in Quiche, if you just take the English words that represent the Quiche words, is much shorter than the English text. And yet it's the same man doing the same translation of the same original text, which means in his head, he knows exactly what it says. And he has 2 separate translations of it that come out because he's translating it in different ways. You could say that one of them is, the literal is more, accurate. Well, yes, it is, but it's harder to understand. And the other one is more fluid, but it puts words in there that aren't there because they aren't required in the Quiche. But they're both accurate translations, and the same man did them in the same understanding. So he understands the Quiche. He knows exactly what it means, and he's going to give us this information. So to say one is tight and one is loose, and that one is therefore better than the other, it depends on what you're trying to do. This is the same man doing the translation. Hofstadter, I've forgotten the name now, but Hofstadter did this. I've been surprised ever since I found it. It's a book called Le Bon Temps de Marron, and it's a 17th century French poem. And he reproduces the poem in French. at the beginning. And then he says, here are, and I think it's like 100 different translations. So the same man takes the same poem in French, which we understand pretty well, and he translates it 100 different ways. One of them, he says, this is a pretty literal translation, but it misses the mood. It misses the lightness. It misses this. And so here's another translation that tries to take the mood and the intent, even though the words are slightly different. Well, here's one that does this. He's got 100 different ways to translate the exact same poem. So when you start talking about loose and tight translation, and loose translation is you're not talking about translation anymore. You're talking about some odd ideas that don't deal with the real world. In the real world, there are different ways to translate the same thing, all of them being accurate, depending on the context and the desire you have to communicate behind what you're translating. So I wouldn't agree with anything he said on that topic.
Right. Because a lot of translation, it's capturing and conveying the meaning from one language to another, and you can do it word for word, but often it's not. And it also makes sense to me, like if someone were to translate, I don't know, from say like a story from one to another, it makes sense to me that obviously names would be literal word for word because the names are important for the most part, or at least be transliterated, but that the rest of it doesn't necessarily have to be word for word to capture the meaning. And we talked about that in our translation interview. But what would you say to someone that might say that, well, if it's a translation coming from God, then it should be perfect word for word. It shouldn't be this looseness or Joseph's vocabulary. And again, maybe that's an assumption.
Yeah, it is an assumption, and what I would say to it is, the way to test your assumption is to look at the texts that we have where we begin that assumption, which is the Bible, Old or New Testament, take your pick. Look at the original language, look at the translations that have come from it, which one is accurate and correct. We've got multiple ways of translating these texts. Robert Alter has just gone through and done a new translation of the Old Testament that is trying to preserve some of the puns. Well, the puns are in a different language, and so you really have to kind of work the language around to make the English pun as well as the Hebrew did. And then you have other people that do different kinds of things. And obviously you go through the alphabet soup of translations of the NAB, the NRSV, the JKV, the NKJKV, this wide range of them. Yeah, they're all translations. And we say that they're all translations of the Word of God. That doesn't mean that every single one of them, God has sat down with it and said, yeah, that's the word I want you to use. It just doesn't happen that way. So if you look at history of how the texts were created and how they've been translated, the assumption again is wrong. It goes back to if I were God, I would have done it this way. You're not God, you didn't do it that way. And the evidence is it wasn't done that way. And either there's no God or your assumption is wrong, and that's what happens in a lot of these cases. I assume that it should have been a perfect translation. It isn't a perfect translation, therefore it must be wrong. Okay, that's a good syllogism, but it has a faulty premise.
Yeah, and I think it's an assumption that's not good to have, because I would have had that assumption of the Book of Mormon translation, well, scripture in general just being inerrant, at least our Latter-day scripture, word for word. So then even whenever I encountered, small changes or revisions being made to grammar, or, some of the things like Jesus being God to the Son of God, or Benjamin to Mosiah, it was just like, that was like devastating to me at first, because I had this very word for word inerrant, this came word for word from God. And we've talked about sort of like the translation in previous videos, so we don't have to rehash that. I did have one question about translation, which I didn't ask you in the previous video, but I encountered a scripture in the Book of Ether, and it talks about both I think it's among the Jaredites, but it talks about like elephants, horses, but then it also talks about Curelums and Cumems in the same verse. And I was curious what your view is on that, because I know we've talked about like some of the animals being anachronistic. You might see it being like a functional translation or translator's anachronism, but then like maybe specific words like Curelums and Cumems might be like a transliteration from like the Jaredite record when Mosiah translated it. I was sort of like curious of your thoughts of like,
Yeah.
then what about like in the same verse there being like horses and elephants?
Yeah, and my answer here, I have to preface it by saying, this is what I think. I don't know that there's any way to come up with a definitive answer to that question.
Yeah, no one really knows.
Yeah, so here's my opinion, and as long as we all understand it's my opinion, I think it's important to remember that what we're getting here is Joseph translating Moroni.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just Joseph translating Moroni, it's Joseph translating Moroni who's translating Ether. And I think what happened in this particular verse, if you're going through and translating and you come to an animal that you recognize, regardless of what the original name was, you go, I know what that animal is. That's an elephant. What's a good example of, you have a coati. You come to a coati and you don't know what it is. And so, you might leave it as coati. But if it's a dog, even though it's the Sholot dog, even though the brand of dog is different, if you know it's a dog, you'll translate dog. And I think what happened is Moroni is translating it, and as he's translating, or Mosiah, however we put the translator. But
so did both of them translate the record of Ether?
I do not see Moroni actually doing any translation. I don't think he did.
Right.
All Mosiah, he has Mosiah's record. I don't see him imagining that he should have done it again. I think he's doing it based off of Mosiah's translation. So I guess it's Mosiah who's doing it. But you come to an elephant, the elephant's a word in your language, that it's an elephant, so you write it down. But you come to a Curelum and a Cumem and you don't know what it is, so you leave it that way. What is a Coatamundi? Well, I've seen one. We don't see, as many of them. After John Sorensen said that a horse might be a tapir, there are a lot of people who now know what a tapir looked like that wouldn't have at the time. And it happens, in addition, in cultural contrasts, there's lots of different ways that you will do something. If it's a familiar animal, of course, you will use the familiar animal. But in a study of Native American languages that are assimilating Western language and elements into them, what they found is it happens sort of in two ways. And with animals, they tend to transliterate the name. And with objects, they tend to incorporate that more as a description in their own language. So it was kind of interesting because it's almost like if it's man-made, we'll make a new word for it. If it's, divine-made, we'll transliterate the name, and bring in the foreign word. So I think that's what's happening here. I think these are animals he didn't recognize, so he wrote down the words they had for them.
Okay. One last question, just sort of like summarizing on this whole discussion. And we've talked about this when we talk about like Book of Mormon historicity or archaeological evidence, but someone might say that, we should see, if the Nephites existed, if they kept records, why don't we see evidence of, Hebrew or Reformed Egyptian writing? Why haven't we found text? Why haven't we found a pot that says, Nephi's pot? Or why haven't we found cities of, the names of Nephite cities? Why is there not conclusive archaeological evidence? And you could say, God doesn't want us to find proof. What would be your response to those people who would say that, like, it seems like this civilization has just disappeared, and we're now sort of saying, oh, well, they were among the Mayan, the Olmec, and so we can't distinguish. And they might say, well, that's kind of convenient. What would you say to someone who might feel that way?
Well, because we're talking specifically about writing, we know that the Maya have been writing for a very long time, but look how little of it we have. Very little of it has been preserved, and the things that were burned were books that were created not that long before. I mean, we don't know, when, but it's unlikely that they had 1,000-year-old books. They wouldn't have survived that long. So it was because they wrote newer books. But we know that the Maya were writing all kinds of things, and we just don't have, that large of a corpus because a lot of it has been lost. So would we have lost the Nephite records? Well, they would have written most of their correspondence on a perishable medium. Just because they use plates doesn't mean that that's, when you send a letter back and forth like we get to, between Moroni and the governor, or the letters going to the Gadiant and Robert King. Those aren't going to be written on metal plates. You don't do that on metal plates. Nobody does that on metal plates. Metal plates are the preserve of, the official people who are doing the official line. So they're not, they're writing on perishable material. And in that area, if it's perishable, it perishes. And the evidence of that is everything perished when the Maya have been there and they've been writing. And the only time we really had good information about them is when they started writing on stone, which wasn't until much later and is even less portable than golden plates. So yeah, they had a lot of writing and it disappeared. The fact that Nephite writing disappeared is not surprising. The only one that has any surprise at all is, what happened to that large record, the large plates. And the answer is, we really have no idea, other than it is highly likely that if they were found, they were, relics of another culture, and they were probably just melted down. They didn't have any good reason to preserve Nephite anything. And the metal had some value that they could use for something else. So it wouldn't surprise me. Not to mention the fact that if it had survived until the Spaniards would have melted it down. So I think it happened a lot earlier than that. But it doesn't surprise me that most of the Nephite writing was missing, because most of the Maya writing is missing.
Okay. Well, Brant, I think this has been a good discussion, talking about and responding to a lot of the things that he brings up, in his presentation on, the two different podcasts.
He has a lot nicer slides than I did.
Say again?
Yeah, he has a lot nicer slides than I do. I haven't used near as many nice slides as.
I really liked his slides. I have to give him that compliment. His slides are really good. I hope we did a fair job at representing sort of his main arguments and asking a lot of the questions. And I appreciated, you giving your responses as well. And if people have more questions, or if there's things that we maybe didn't cover or felt like we didn't fully represent, you can send me a message or email me or comment underneath, and maybe we can bring Brant back to maybe whenever I watch all the episodes, we could do another part. But I think we've done quite a good comprehensive discussion over it. So yeah, I really appreciate this time. Do you have any closing thoughts, Brant, or anything sort of in summary on what John Lundwall said, or anything to do with the Book of Mormon, or those people who maybe are having concerns over it?
He did not convince me that the Book of Mormon isn't true. So
I was near ready to throw out your book on the Book of Mormon is history, the translation, like, no, get rid of all this, all these convertences. Right. No.
Yeah, no, haven't done that.
Not quite. Need something else. Okay, well, Brant, thanks so much for coming on for this interview. Listeners who've watched it, if you've enjoyed this episode, give it a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe. Don't forget to leave your comments if you have any questions or any thoughts on this. Any additional questions or concerns, maybe we can bring Brant back on to discuss it. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.